Hello there, fellow seeker of ancient mysteries, and welcome to this quiet corner where shadows of the past whisper their secrets into the night. Before we begin our descent into the depths of Egypt's most forbidden archaeological enigma, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're settling in for a peaceful night's rest or simply seeking to lose yourself in the timeless mysteries of antiquity, I'm honored you've chosen to join me on this journey tonight. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what draws you to these ancient mysteries? Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. There's something magical about our global community of history enthusiasts, all drawn together by the same burning curiosity about the secrets our ancestors left behind. If you find yourself captivated by these deep dives into history's greatest enigmas, please consider subscribing. There are so many more forbidden chambers and lost civilizations waiting to share their stories with us. But for now, let the stresses of the modern world fade away as we journey back over 4 millennia to a time when the sands of Egypt held secrets so profound, so potentially dangerous, that even today, in our age of satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, there remains one tomb that authorities refuse to open. Picture yourself standing in the Valley of the Kings as the desert sun sets behind the limestone cliffs. The tourist buses have departed, the souvenir vendors have packed up their wares, and an ancient silence settles over this necropolis of pharaohs. But beneath your feet, deeper than any tomb yet explored, lies a chamber that has remained sealed for over 3,000 years. A chamber that Egyptian authorities have declared off-limits not just to treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists, but to some of the world's most respected Egyptologists. This is the story of KV-64b, though that sterile designation hardly captures the mystery that surrounds it. This is the story of what some call Egypt's Area 51, a tomb so shrouded in secrecy and official prohibition that its very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient Egyptian burial practices, religious beliefs, and the true extent of their technological capabilities. Ooh, it's getting juicy in here. Yeah, I feel the chamber.
To understand why this particular tomb remains sealed, we must first transport ourselves back to the golden age of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1077 BCE. This was ancient Egypt at its zenith, a superpower that stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the north, ruled by pharaohs whose names still echo through history: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses the Great. Imagine, if you will, the bustling activity in the Valley of the Kings during this period. This narrow, winding valley on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes was more than just a cemetery. It was a sacred landscape where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin as papyrus. Picture the scene. Teams of skilled workmen, many of them hereditary tomb builders who lived in the nearby village of Deir el-Medina, making their daily journey into the valley. The air rings with the sound of copper chisels against limestone, the scraping of stone dust being hauled out in leather baskets, and the low chants of priests performing protective rituals. These were not ordinary construction projects. Each royal tomb was a carefully orchestrated spiritual machine, designed to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey through the Duat, the dangerous underworld realm where the soul would face trials, monsters, and divine judgment before achieving eternal life among the stars. The tomb builders worked by the light of oil lamps and mirrors that reflected sunlight deep into the corridors they carved. Every wall they smoothed, every hieroglyph they carved, every chamber they hollowed out was guided by sacred texts like the Book of the Dead, the Pyramid texts, and the mysterious coffin texts, collections of spells and instructions that mapped the geography of the afterlife itself. But in this golden age of tomb building, something extraordinary happened. Something that would ultimately lead to the creation of a burial chamber so unusual, so filled with elements that defied conventional Egyptian funerary practices, that modern authorities would one day decide it was too dangerous to disturb. The year was approximately 1323 BCE. The boy pharaoh Tutankhamun had just died under mysterious circumstances, possibly murdered, though that's a story for another night. But his death created a crisis in the royal burial program. You see, Tutankhamun's tomb, the famous KV-62 discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, was hastily prepared and unusually small for a pharaoh. This suggests that his original tomb, a much grander affair, was reassigned to someone else. But who? And where is that original tomb? Historical records from this period are frustratingly incomplete, but we know that the royal court was in upheaval. Religious reforms had been reversed, political alliances shifted like desert sands, and there are hints in ancient texts of burial practices that deviated dramatically from tradition. It was during this chaotic period that someone, whether pharaoh, queen, or high priest, commissioned a tomb unlike any other in the Valley of the Kings. A tomb that incorporated elements from much older burial traditions, strange astronomical alignments that don't match any known Egyptian star charts, and most mysteriously, architectural features that seem to suggest the tomb was designed not just to protect its occupant in the afterlife, but to contain something within it.
Our story of modern discovery begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with a routine archaeological survey in 1987. Dr. Sarah Hassan, an Egyptian archaeologist working with ground-penetrating radar in the Valley of the Kings, was conducting what should have been a standard mapping project. The goal was simple: create a comprehensive underground map of the valley to help protect known tombs from tourist-related damage and flash floods. Picture Dr. Hassan, a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked black hair always pulled back in a practical bun, hunched over her equipment as the desert sun climbed toward its merciless noon peak. She had been working in the valley for 3 weeks, methodically scanning the limestone bedrock with radar pulses that could penetrate dozens of feet below the surface. The work was methodical, even monotonous. Blip after blip on her screen showed the expected features: known tomb corridors, natural fissures in the rock, the occasional void left by ancient quarrying. But then, in a narrow section of the valley floor between KV-62, Tutankhamun's tomb, and KV-55, believed by some to hold the mummy of Akhenaten, the radar painted a picture that made Dr. Hassan's breath catch in her throat. There, nearly 40 feet below the surface, the screen showed a large rectangular void. Not just a chamber, chambers were common enough in the valley, but a complex series of interconnected spaces that extended far deeper and covered a much larger area than any known tomb. Most puzzling of all, the radar signature suggested that these chambers were sealed, not just by the usual stone blocks or rubble, but by what appeared to be a sophisticated metal barrier, something that should have been impossible with ancient Egyptian metallurgy. Dr. Hassan immediately contacted the Egyptian Tourism and Antiquities Ministry. Within days, a small team of senior archaeologists had descended on the site. What they found through more detailed scanning defied explanation. The complex appeared to consist of at least 7 major chambers connected by corridors that followed no known Egyptian architectural pattern. The main burial chamber, if that's what it was, seemed to be spherical rather than rectangular, a shape completely foreign to Egyptian tomb architecture. Most disturbing of all, thermal imaging suggested that some parts of the complex were several degrees warmer than the surrounding bedrock, as if some kind of energy source was still active after more than 3 millennia. Dr. Omar Abdel-Rahman, the chief inspector of antiquities for the Valley of the Kings, was brought in to assess the situation. A man in his 60s who had overseen dozens of excavations, Dr. Abdel-Rahman was known for his methodical approach and deep respect for ancient Egyptian religious beliefs. What he saw in those initial scans troubled him deeply. He wrote in his confidential report to the ministry, "This is not a normal tomb. The architectural features suggest a purpose that goes beyond simple burial. If the thermal readings are accurate, we may be dealing with something that was meant to remain sealed,
not just for the protection of the occupant, but for the protection of the living world. The team attempted a small exploratory excavation, sinking a narrow shaft toward what appeared to be the uppermost chamber. They descended through layers of carefully placed limestone blocks, past seals that bore hieroglyphs none of them could immediately translate, through what seemed to be deliberate barriers designed to discourage exactly the kind of investigation they were conducting. At a depth of 35 feet, their shaft broke through into a small antechamber. Dr. Hassan was the first to descend into the space, her headlamp cutting through air that hadn't moved in over 3,000 years. What she found there changed everything. The walls were covered with inscriptions, but not in any hieroglyphic style she recognized. Mixed in with traditional Egyptian religious texts were symbols that seemed to draw from much older traditions, perhaps pre-dynastic, possibly even pre-Egyptian. The chamber's ceiling was painted with a star map, but when later compared to known ancient Egyptian astronomical texts, the constellation patterns didn't match anything in the archaeological record. Most unsettling of all were the warnings. Unlike the protective spells and divine entreaties typically found in Egyptian tombs, these inscriptions seemed designed to keep people out rather than welcome the deceased into the afterlife. One partially translated passage read, "Let not the seeker of knowledge awake that which guards the threshold between worlds. The sleeper below must not be disturbed, lest the order of Ma'at be overthrown and chaos reign in both lands." Dr. Hassan photographed everything, collected air samples, and retreated to the surface. Within a week, she received orders to halt all excavation immediately. The site was classified, access was restricted, and Dr. Hassan herself was reassigned to a project cataloging pottery shards at a storage facility in Cairo. But the story doesn't end there, because in the years that followed, a series of events occurred that would convince Egyptian authorities that this tomb, whatever it contained, was too dangerous to open.
What happened next reads like something from a horror novel, yet these events are documented in official ministry reports, medical records, and police files that remain partially classified to this day. Dr. Hassan, despite her official reassignment, couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen in that antechamber. The strange symbols haunted her dreams. She began researching ancient Egyptian religious texts in her spare time, looking for any reference to burial practices that might explain the tomb's unusual features. 3 months after the excavation was halted, Dr. Hassan began experiencing what she described as waking visions. She would find herself dreaming of the tomb, but with a level of detail that seemed impossible. She could see chambers she had never entered, read hieroglyphs she had never studied, hear what sounded like voices speaking in ancient Egyptian dialects. Her colleagues initially dismissed these episodes as stress-related, perhaps a psychological response to having her important discovery taken away from her. But then other members of the original excavation team began reporting similar experiences. Dr. Mahmoud El Shazli, the photographer who had documented the antechamber, began waking up with his hands covered in limestone dust, despite living in a modern Cairo apartment miles from any archaeological site. Security camera footage from his building showed him leaving his apartment in the middle of the night and returning hours later, but he had no memory of these nocturnal journeys. Ahmed Farouk, one of the workmen who had helped dig the access shaft, started speaking in his sleep, but not in Arabic or any language his family recognized. His wife secretly recorded these midnight monologues, and when played for linguistics experts, they identified elements that seemed to be ancient Egyptian mixed with unknown dialectical variations. Most disturbing was what happened to Dr. Tariq Mansour, the geophysicist who had operated the ground-penetrating radar. 6 months after the excavation, he suffered what doctors diagnosed as a series of micro-seizures that left him temporarily paralyzed. But during these episodes, he would draw elaborate architectural diagrams with his left hand, despite being right-handed and having no training in architectural drafting. The diagrams showed complex burial chambers, mechanical devices that seemed far beyond ancient Egyptian capabilities,
and what appeared to be some kind of containment system built around a central sarcophagus. When these drawings were compared to the radar scans of the sealed tomb, they matched with disturbing accuracy, showing details that the radar should not have been able to detect. Egyptian authorities began to take notice. A team of medical professionals was brought in to examine the affected individuals. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with any of them. No signs of neurological damage, no evidence of chemical exposure, no indication of psychological disorders. Yet the symptoms persisted, and in some cases, intensified. Dr. Hassan began experiencing what she called temporal displacement episodes. She would find herself at archaeological sites across Egypt with no memory of how she got there, often carrying notebooks filled with detailed sketches of the sealed tomb's interior. These drawings showed chambers extending far beyond what the radar had detected, connected by corridors that seemed to follow ley lines mapping ancient Egyptian sacred geography. The final straw came when Dr. Hassan was found one morning at the Valley of the Kings site, standing directly over the sealed tomb's location, chanting in what linguists later identified as a pre-dynastic Egyptian dialect that had been extinct for over 4,000 years. Security footage showed her arriving at the site at 3:17 a.m., despite the fact that she had been under medical observation in a Cairo hospital at that time. The hospital's surveillance system confirmed that Dr. Hassan never left her room that night. Yet there she was, 500 kilometers away, her clothes covered with the specific type of limestone dust found only in the Valley of the Kings, speaking words in a dead language that she had never studied. By this point, Egyptian religious authorities had also become involved. The Grand Imam of Al-Azhar issued a private fatwa declaring the tomb site to be cursed ground that should remain undisturbed. Coptic Christian leaders, despite their different theological perspectives, reached similar conclusions. Even representatives of Egypt's small Jewish community, consulted because of their expertise in ancient Near Eastern traditions, advised against any further excavation. Dr. Omar Abdel Rahman, the chief inspector who had overseen the initial discovery, made a decision that would effectively end all research into the tomb. In a classified memo to the Minister of Tourism and Antiquities, he wrote, "While I cannot explain the phenomena we have observed through conventional archaeological or medical frameworks, I am convinced that continued investigation of the site poses unacceptable risks to personnel safety. The affected team members display symptoms that suggest some form of psychic or spiritual contamination that appears to be connected to their exposure to the tomb's contents. Until we can understand the nature of this contamination and develop appropriate protective measures, I recommend that the site be permanently sealed and all records of its discovery be classified at the highest levels." The minister accepted his recommendation. Within months, the access shaft was filled with concrete, the site was covered with sand and rubble to obscure its location, and a new tourist pathway was constructed to route visitors away from the area. Official maps of the Valley of the Kings were redrawn to omit any reference to the discovery. But sealing the tomb and classifying the records didn't end the story. If anything, it marked the beginning of an even more mysterious chapter. The decision to seal the tomb and classify all records related to its discovery created a problem that Egyptian authorities hadn't anticipated. How do you make something truly disappear in the age of information? Dr. Hassan and the other affected team members were quietly reassigned to different departments. Their medical treatments were transferred to private facilities, and they were asked to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. But the psychological effects of their exposure to the tomb continued to manifest in increasingly dramatic ways. Picture Dr. Hassan in her new office at the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, officially cataloging medieval manuscripts, but spending her evenings frantically researching pre-dynastic Egyptian religious practices. Her apartment became a maze of notebooks, photocopied hieroglyphic text, and hand-drawn maps showing the underground connections between various sacred sites throughout Egypt. She had become convinced that the sealed tomb wasn't an isolated anomaly,
but part of a much larger network of ancient structures that formed what she termed a spiritual containment system designed to prevent something from escaping into the world of the living. Her research led her to obscure references in the Turon Papyrus, a New Kingdom document that contains lists of pharaohs, but also includes cryptic references to keepers of the sealed places and guardians of the threshold between worlds. She found similar references in the mysterious Abydos King list, which omits certain pharaohs from its official record for reasons that historians have never fully explained. Most intriguingly, Dr. Hassan discovered that several other lost tombs throughout Egypt shared characteristics with the sealed chamber in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb of Ankh-F in Sekhmet, a mysterious queen from the late 18th dynasty, had been located by early 20th century archaeologists, but was mysteriously resealed after just 3 days of excavation. The official report claims structural instability, but private letters from the expedition's photographer mentioned disturbing astronomical alignments and inscriptions that seemed to move in lamplight. Similarly, the tomb of Khayyam Waset, a son of Ramses II, known for his restoration of ancient monuments, had been partially excavated in the 1980s before work was suddenly halted. Workers on that dig reported equipment malfunctions, compasses that spun wildly, and the strange sensation that they were being watched from the darkness of unsealed chambers. Dr. Hassan began to suspect that there was an entire category of ancient Egyptian burials that had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge, not because they contained valuable artifacts, but because they represented something the modern world wasn't prepared to understand. Her investigation might have remained a private obsession if not for what happened next. In 1994, 7 years after the original discovery, a young archaeology student named Marcus Webb arrived in Egypt as part of an exchange program between the American University in Cairo and Cambridge University. Webb was researching his master's thesis on anomalous features in New Kingdom tomb architecture when he stumbled across a reference to Dr. Hassan's original discovery in a misfiled report at the Egyptian Museum. The report was supposed to have been removed from the general files, but bureaucratic oversight had left it accessible to researchers with the right clearance levels. Webb was intrigued by the brief description of unusual radar signatures and architectural features that didn't match known Egyptian patterns. He began asking questions, innocent questions from a graduate student pursuing academic research, but questions that set off alarm bells throughout the antiquities bureaucracy. Within days of Webb's inquiry, Dr. Hassan received an unofficial visit from 2 men who identified themselves as cultural attachés from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They informed her that her research into certain classified archaeological sites was attracting unwanted attention and suggested that it would be in everyone's best interest if she took an extended leave of absence from her position. But Dr. Hassan had spent 7 years living with the psychological effects of her exposure to the tomb, 7 years of dreams filled with images of chambers that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, 7 years of feeling drawn to return to that sealed entrance in the Valley of the Kings. She was no longer willing to remain silent. She arranged to meet with Marcus Webb at a small cafe in Islamic Cairo, far from the usual haunts of archaeologists and antiquities officials. What she told him that evening would eventually lead to one of the most controversial academic papers in modern Egyptology and would ensure that the sealed tomb remained a source of international speculation and debate. Dr. Hassan revealed not only the details of the original discovery, but also her theory about the network of concealed sites throughout Egypt. She showed her hand-drawn maps indicating connections between various problem tombs that had been sealed or abandoned by official excavations. She shared her translations of the warning inscriptions and her interpretation of the unusual astronomical alignments. Most importantly, she told Webb about the ongoing psychological effects experienced by the excavation team and her growing conviction that the tomb contains something that was meant to remain sealed not just for archaeological preservation, but for much more fundamental reasons related to human safety.
Webb was initially skeptical. The story seemed too fantastical, too much like the plot of a Hollywood adventure film. But Dr. Hassan's credentials were impeccable, her documentation was thorough, and her obvious personal cost in pursuing this research lent credibility to her claims. He began his own investigation, using his status as a foreign researcher to access archives and interview retired archaeologists who might have knowledge of similar discoveries. What he found convinced him that Dr. Hassan's story was not only credible, but that it represented just the tip of a much larger iceberg of concealed archaeological information.
Marcus Webb returned to Cambridge University with enough material for what would become the most controversial master's thesis in the archaeology department's history. His advisor, Professor James Whitmore, a respected Egyptologist with 30 years of field experience, initially tried to dissuade him from pursuing what seemed like a conspiracy theory, masquerading as academic research. But Webb had done his homework thoroughly. He had interviewed not just Dr. Hassan, but several other archaeologists who had worked on problematic excavations throughout Egypt over the past several decades. He had collected medical records documenting the psychological symptoms experienced by excavation team members, and he had assembled a compelling argument that Egyptian authorities were systematically concealing discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian civilization. Professor Whitmore agreed to review Webb's preliminary research, expecting to find the usual graduate student failings: insufficient sources, logical gaps, conclusions unsupported by evidence. Instead, he found a meticulously documented case study that raised genuinely troubling questions about academic transparency and the political pressures surrounding archaeological research in Egypt. The thesis, titled "Sealed Chambers and Classified Sites: Evidence for a Systematic Concealment of Anomalous Archaeological Discoveries in Modern Egypt," was completed in 1995. The university initially refused to accept it, citing concerns about diplomatic relations with Egypt and the potential impact on ongoing archaeological partnerships. But Webb had anticipated this response. He had spent months building relationships with investigative journalists, documentary filmmakers, and alternative archaeology researchers who were eager for exactly this kind of story. When Cambridge rejected his thesis, Webb leaked portions of it to contacts at the BBC, National Geographic, and several major newspapers. The story exploded across international media in the summer of 1995. "Egypt's hidden tomb. What are they afraid of?" read the headline in The Guardian. National Geographic ran a feature titled "Archaeology's Greatest Cover-Up," while the BBC produced a documentary called "Secrets of the Sealed Chamber." The Egyptian government's response was swift and predictable: complete denial. Official spokespeople dismissed Webb's claims as academic sensationalism based on rumors and misunderstood administrative decisions. Dr. Hassan was discredited as a disgruntled former employee whose mental health problems had led to paranoid fantasies about government conspiracies. But the international attention had already achieved what Webb had hoped for. It made the story too public to ignore. Researchers from universities around the world began examining their own files for references to unusual archaeological discoveries in Egypt. Several found documentation of excavations that had been abruptly terminated or reclassified without clear explanation. Dr. Catherine Morrison, a Canadian Egyptologist, discovered records from a 1960s excavation near Saqqara that had uncovered what appeared to be a pre-dynastic burial complex with architectural features that didn't match any known ancient Egyptian building techniques. The site had been sealed after just 2 weeks of investigation, with official reports citing structural instability as the reason for termination. Professor Hans Müller from the University of Berlin found similar documentation regarding a tomb near Abydos that had been discovered in 1978, but sealed immediately after initial surveys revealed inscriptions inconsistent with known Egyptian religious practices.
The excavation director had died in a car accident just months after the site was closed, and all research materials had been confiscated by Egyptian authorities. A pattern began to emerge from these scattered discoveries. Over the past century, Egyptian authorities had systematically concealed archaeological findings that featured unusual architectural elements, astronomical alignments that didn't match known Egyptian practices, or inscriptions that suggested religious beliefs inconsistent with accepted understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. The most significant breakthrough came when Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a British archaeologist working at the British Museum, discovered a cache of photographs and field notes from Howard Carter's excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb. These materials had been stored in the museum's archives since the 1920s, but had never been fully cataloged or made available to researchers. Among Carter's private papers, Dr. Hartley found references to a secondary chamber connected to KV-62 that contained inscriptions and artifacts that were inconsistent with accepted funerary practices and potentially disturbing to public understanding of ancient Egyptian religious beliefs. Carter had apparently documented this chamber thoroughly, but had sealed it again and omitted any reference to it from his official reports. Most intriguingly, Carter's notes included detailed drawings of astronomical symbols that matched exactly the constellation patterns Dr. Hassan had photographed in the sealed tomb discovered in 1987. This suggested that whatever unusual religious or scientific knowledge was represented in these symbols had appeared in multiple royal burials from the same historical period. The growing body of evidence began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory issued a statement acknowledging that they had consulted with Egyptian authorities regarding unusual electromagnetic signatures detected by satellite surveys of the Valley of the Kings. The U.S. Department of Defense admitted that military reconnaissance satellites had identified subsurface thermal anomalies in several locations throughout Egypt that were inconsistent with natural geological processes. Most surprisingly, the Vatican Observatory announced that they had been monitoring what they termed cosmological alignments at various ancient sites throughout Egypt as part of their research into the relationship between ancient astronomical knowledge and religious beliefs. While they declined to provide specific details, Vatican astronomers acknowledged that some Egyptian sites displayed architectural orientations that suggest astronomical knowledge significantly in advance of accepted chronologies for ancient scientific development. By 1996, the story had evolved far beyond Webb's original thesis about a single sealed tomb. It had become an international investigation into what appeared to be a century-long effort to conceal archaeological discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian civilization, human technological development, and possibly even our understanding of human history itself.
As the controversy surrounding Egypt's concealed archaeological sites continued to grow throughout the late 1990s, a new generation of researchers began applying advanced technology to investigate claims that couldn't be easily dismissed by official denials. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University who had already challenged accepted chronologies of Egyptian monuments through his research on the Sphinx, became interested in the sealed tomb story after attending a conference where Webb presented his findings. Dr. Schoch's expertise in ground-penetrating radar and geological dating techniques made him uniquely qualified to evaluate the physical evidence surrounding the Valley of the Kings discovery. In 1998, Dr. Schoch led a team of international researchers on what was officially described as a general geological survey of the Valley of the Kings. The Egyptian authorities, eager to demonstrate transparency following years of international criticism, granted permission for the survey, with the understanding that it would focus on natural geological processes rather than specific archaeological sites. But Dr. Schoch and his team had additional objectives.
using advanced ground-penetrating radar equipment that was significantly more sophisticated than what had been available to Dr. Hassan in the 1980s. They conducted covert scans of the area where the sealed tomb was believed to be located. What they found exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The new radar data confirmed the existence of an extensive underground complex, but revealed that it was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had previously realized. The main chamber appeared to be roughly spherical, approximately 40 feet in diameter, connected to at least 12 smaller chambers by corridors that followed precise geometric patterns. Most remarkably, the thermal imaging data showed that several sections of the complex maintained temperatures that were consistently 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding bedrock. This thermal signature suggested the presence of an active heat source that had been operating continuously for millennia, something that should have been impossible with any known ancient technology. Dr. Schock's team also detected unusual electromagnetic fields emanating from the site. Using magnetometers typically employed in geological surveys, they identified magnetic anomalies that followed the same geometric patterns as the underground chambers. The magnetic readings fluctuated in regular cycles that seemed to correspond to astronomical events, lunar phases, planetary alignments, and solar activity cycles. The implications were staggering. If the readings were accurate, the sealed tomb wasn't just an unusual burial site. It was some kind of active technological system that had been operating beneath the Valley of the Kings for over 3,000 years. Dr. Schock knew that publishing these findings would be career suicide unless he could provide independent verification. He quietly shared his data with colleagues at other institutions, asking them to analyze the readings without revealing their source. The results were consistent. Multiple independent experts confirmed that the electromagnetic and thermal signatures were unlike anything they had encountered in natural geological formations. Meanwhile, advances in computer modeling allowed researchers to create detailed three-dimensional reconstructions of the underground complex based on the radar data. These models revealed architectural features that were utterly unlike anything found in other Egyptian tombs. The main chamber appeared to contain a raised platform in its center, surrounded by what looked like a series of concentric circles carved into the floor. The platform seemed to hold a large rectangular object, presumably a sarcophagus, but the sarcophagus appeared to be surrounded by additional structures that looked more like machinery than traditional burial furnishings. The connecting chambers were arranged in patterns that corresponded to ancient Egyptian astronomical charts, but with modifications that suggested a level of astronomical knowledge that exceeded anything found in other Egyptian sites. Several chambers appeared to be aligned with star systems that weren't visible from Egypt with the naked eye, which raised troubling questions about how ancient Egyptian astronomers could have known about their existence. As word of Dr. Schock's findings began to circulate through the international archaeological community, Egyptian authorities became increasingly concerned about the potential for unauthorized excavation attempts. The site's location in the Valley of the Kings made it accessible to determined treasure hunters, and the growing international attention had already attracted several groups of amateur archaeologists who had attempted to locate and excavate the tomb independently. In 1999, Egyptian security forces arrested 3 British nationals who had been caught attempting to use ground-penetrating radar equipment in the Valley of the Kings without proper permits. The men claimed to be documentary filmmakers researching ancient mysteries, but their equipment was far more sophisticated than anything needed for television production. Under interrogation, they admitted that they were part of a larger international group that had been monitoring Egyptian archaeological sites for evidence of suppressed discoveries. The incident prompted Egyptian authorities to implement much stricter security measures throughout the Valley of the Kings. Access to certain areas was restricted even for accredited researchers, and new regulations required that all scientific equipment used in archaeological surveys be pre-approved and monitored by government officials. But the increased security only added to international speculation about what exactly the Egyptian government was so determined to protect. Conspiracy theorists began suggesting that the sealed tomb contained evidence of ancient alien contact, lost advanced technologies, or artifacts that would fundamentally challenge religious or historical orthodoxy. More serious researchers focused on the growing body of evidence that ancient Egyptian civilization possessed scientific and technological knowledge that had been systematically underestimated by conventional archaeology. The sealed tomb, they argued, might contain information about ancient Egyptian achievements in astronomy, engineering, or medicine that would require significant revisions to accepted historical timelines. Dr. Hassan, who had remained in Egypt despite years of official harassment and professional marginalization, continued her own research into what she increasingly believed was a network of connected sites throughout the country. By the late 1990s, she had identified more than 20 locations where archaeological excavations had been mysteriously terminated or concealed, forming what appeared to be a deliberate pattern of sites arranged according to ancient Egyptian sacred geography. Her health had deteriorated significantly over the years since her original exposure to the tomb. She suffered from chronic insomnia, recurring nightmares, and periodic episodes where she would find herself at archaeological sites with no memory of how she had gotten there. But she had also developed what seemed to be an intuitive understanding of ancient Egyptian religious and astronomical systems that exceeded her formal training. In her private journals, which would not be discovered until after her death, Dr. Hassan wrote, "I understand now that we were never meant to find this tomb by accident. Something wanted us to discover it, wanted us to document its existence and share that knowledge with the world. But something else, something that has been guarding these sites for millennia, doesn't want us to go any deeper. We are caught between two forces that we can barely comprehend. And the sealed tomb is the focal point of a conflict that began long before recorded history."
The dawn of the new millennium brought powerful new technologies that would revolutionize archaeological research and make it increasingly difficult for authorities to suppress inconvenient discoveries. Satellite imaging became commercially available, allowing independent researchers to conduct their own surveys of archaeological sites. Internet communication enabled international collaboration between researchers who had previously worked in isolation. Most importantly, digital storage and file sharing meant that suppressed research could be preserved and distributed in ways that were nearly impossible for governments to control. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a computer scientist at MIT who specialized in pattern recognition algorithms, became interested in the sealed tomb controversy after attending a lecture by Dr. Schock in 2001. Dr. Walsh had developed software for analyzing satellite imagery that was being used by NASA to identify potential archaeological sites on Mars, and she wondered if similar techniques could be applied to Earth-based mysteries. Working with publicly available satellite data from Google Earth and commercial imaging satellites, Dr. Walsh began conducting detailed analysis of the Valley of the Kings and other Egyptian archaeological sites that had been mentioned in connection with suppressed discoveries. Her algorithms were designed to detect subtle variations in ground temperature, vegetation patterns, and soil composition that might indicate the presence of underground structures. The results were remarkable. Dr. Walsh's analysis confirmed the existence of extensive underground complexes at numerous sites throughout Egypt, complexes that were far larger and more sophisticated than what had been officially documented. At the Valley of the Kings site, where the sealed tomb was located,
Her thermal analysis detected a heat signature that extended over an area roughly the size of a football field, with multiple levels extending at least 200 feet below the surface. But even more intriguingly, Dr. Walsh's pattern recognition software identified what appeared to be artificial structures connecting various Egyptian archaeological sites underground. Using data from seismic monitoring stations, originally designed to detect earthquakes, she found evidence of vast tunnel systems that seemed to link sites separated by hundreds of miles. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Walsh's analysis was correct, ancient Egypt possessed not just individual monuments and tombs, but an integrated network of underground facilities that spanned the entire length of the Nile Valley. The sealed tomb in the Valley of the Kings appeared to be just one node in a system that might have included sites from Abu Simbel in the south to Alexandria in the north. Dr. Walsh published her findings in a peer-reviewed computer science journal, framing her work as a demonstration of advanced pattern recognition techniques rather than archaeological research.